Okay, Amesbury FM. Once again, that's where we are. Probably hottest day of the year so far. It's a pretty warm one. It's the 25th of June, 22 minutes past 7, year 2020. I thought that I might talk about the way we do science these days. That's what I thought I'd talk about today. And by way of example, I thought I'd talk about a story from a guy called Weinstein. If you want to know who Weinstein is, well, he probably came to a certain amount of prominence in 2017 as a result of the shit show that was Evergreen State College. But, you know, that's not the most interesting story that he has to tell. The story I'm about to tell you is much more interesting than that. In the late 90s, he was an undergraduate student at Michigan, and his interest was evolutionary trade-offs and senescence. Now, senescence, to the layman, is aging. And he was persuaded that there was a particular hypothesis that explained aging. The name for that hypothesis was antagonistic pleiotropy of senescence, which basically means that natural evolution selects for traits that help you when you're young, even when they don't help you when you're old, or may harm you when you're old. And this has been observed everywhere in nature, and people were more or less satisfied that the hypothesis was explaining things about nature. But no one knew what the biological explanation was. Now it turns out around that time there were two separate strands of investigation concerning aging and cancer research, both of which were concerned with a region of the genome called telomeres. These are repeating nucleotides, sequences of nucleotides at the end of each chromosome. And every time a cell divides, they shorten. So this seems to suggest that the length of the telomere will set an upper limit on the number of times a cell can divide. And this represented to some a tantalizing insight into what might be causing aging and all the things that go along with it. At the same time, on the cancer research side, cancerous tissue was discovered to contain an enzyme called Telomeres, whose effect was to lengthen telomeres. And so the cancer research people were thinking, right, if we can limit telomere length, we might cure cancer. Meanwhile, the aging people were saying, if we can increase telomere length, we might cure old age. And neither of these two strands, you know, the people looking into them, were talking to one another. And Weinstein noticed this, and it interested him because it was a classic example of the thing that he was looking into, which is evolutionary trade-offs. But there was a problem. There was a fact that everybody knew that tended to confound the idea that long telomeres necessarily meant a long life. And the problem was mice. Mice were known to have long telomeres, but not very long lives. So, okay, how do we make sense of this? Because the hypothesis seemed to be borne out everywhere you looked. And yet here was this problem. Something had to give. And Weinstein suspected that mice didn't really have long telomeres at all. It was simply the particular brand of laboratory mice they had that had them. And so he got in touch with someone called Greider, who subsequently won a Nobel Prize, and asked about, is it possible that mice actually don't have long telomeres, but, only laboratory mice do? And she said that she thought that mice probably had long telomeres, but it's interesting that depending on which lab in Europe you go to, or which supplier, the mice you get from them had different length telomeres. But, she said she'd get her guys onto it and do some work on the issue. And they subsequently found that wild mice had short telomeres. It was also known that laboratory mice were notoriously cancer prone. So, we might be able to infer from that the reason these things were dying was not through old age, it's just through cancer. But as these were experimental mice anyway, it may be that they died for other reasons to do with whatever experiments were performed on them. In other words, no one left them alone long enough to know how old they would die just from old age. Unfortunately, this had a lot of implications for the laboratory work that was done on these mice, because these things were used for cancer research, drug safety testing, and all of these sorts of things. Now, if you test a cancer drug on a creature that's got a very long telomere, and you know that telomere length is kind of important to cancer research, and the drugs that you hope to develop are going to be used on, say, human beings, which are not like laboratory mice in that regard, how the fuck do you know whether your cancer research is valid? And on drug testing, you test your drug on, say, laboratory mice. Scientific ethics determine that human testing is a very, very late stage in the approval process. And so, you draw all sorts of conclusions from your tests on these mice. But it would appear that these mice are nigh on indestructible, because their tissues can repair themselves pretty much indefinitely because of these long telomeres. You then transfer that same thing into humans, and you've no idea the damage it can do. I think there was a drug called Vioxx, which was supposedly supposed to provide arthritis relief. And they didn't know that when they rolled it out into the human population, it actually caused heart trouble. Which is kind of interesting, because one of the things we know about human physiology is that different tissues in the body replenish themselves, to a greater or lesser extent depending on which tissue it is. So, for example, the liver, that'll put on tissue like it's going out of fashion. The pancreas, on the other hand, doesn't. The heart is an organ that hardly it's not very effective at replenishing its tissue. And the brain is another organ like that. Consequently, cancers of these organs are kind of uncommon. They happen, but not very common. On the other hand, tissue that's constantly replenishing itself, these are prone to cancers. Now, human beings are the current iteration of a process that's, as far as we can tell, been ongoing for hundreds of millions of years. And this is what evolution has delivered. And that's why evolutionary trade-offs it's such an interesting field. Because one of the warnings is that you have to be actually quite careful about what you do, to any physiology or any ecosystem, because you don't know what effects that might have. There's a phrase that says evolution is smarter than you are. Well, it's not smart exactly, but it's been at it a very long time, and there's been a hell of a lot of trial and error there. And what we see around us now is the trial. This is the results. A great many of the errors have been weeded out. This process of evolution may be one of the most effective at producing optimal entities in an environment. So we have this problem with the mice. Weinstein, having discovered this, wrote a paper about it, and I believe it even had it published. But no one was interested. No one was interested in the idea that, the drug safety testing you're doing is possibly very unreliable, because you're not actually finding out whether it's safe to use on humans. And he spent the best part of 10 years trying everything he could, writing op-eds for the New York Times and, contacting this body or that body. I can't even remember half of them. 10 years, and he couldn't get arrested. And he doesn't exactly know why this is. All he knows is the kind of reaction he got from people that he contacted. So on his own account, he says that when he contacted the press, the reaction was typically they were interested to start with, and then they weren't interested. So, they had a word with their editor or something like that. And none of the answers he was given about why interest evaporated were very satisfactory. So, it's taken care of. We're taking care of it. Statements like that, and you can't make any headway beyond that. And, at the time, no one had heard of Brett Weinstein. I suspect not too many people even now have heard of him. Now, it looks as though there's a certain amount of conformity in scientific circles. The costs of breaching the prescribed narrative are at least felt to be so serious that it discourages people from actually saying what they think. And there's some evidence to bear that out. Actually, there is a huge amount of regression to the mean in the modern scientific process. It's possible that even Einstein wouldn't recognise what we call peer review nowadays, and that's a century ago or something, possibly not even that. And I know this has happened in other areas of science, you know, and it's taking a hell of a long time to correct errors that way. Decades it's taking. It's taking decades in the case of dietary science, which in the 20th century, looking increasingly like that, went off the rails really quite badly. And that might go some way to explaining why we've noticed an increase in diabetes right now. But that may be a subject of another presentation. But that's really what I'm talking about. You know, the fact that you've got to watch very carefully accounts given by people who claim that they're scientific accounts. You know, that could mean all sorts of things.